Hello and welcome to Podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. I would like to thank everyone who has donated to the show. Your contributions help us make the show sustainable. When you're ready to launch your next project, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so you should check out Linode at linode.com/podcastinit and get a $20 credit to try out their fast and reliable Linux virtual servers for running your next app. You'll want to make sure that your users don't have to put up with bugs, so you should use Rollbar for tracking and aggregating your application errors to find and fix the bugs in your application before your users notice they exist. Use the link rollbar.com/podcastinit to get 90 days and 300,000 errors tracked for free on their Bootstrap plan. You can also visit our site at podcastinit.com to sign up for our newsletter, read the show notes, and get in touch. And to help other people find the show, you can leave a review on iTunes or Google Play Music and tell your friends and coworkers. You can also join the community at discourse.pythonpodcast.com to find out about upcoming guests, suggest questions, and propose show ideas. Your host as usual is Tobias Macey, and today I'm interviewing Alexis Metaireau and Mathieu Leplatre about Kinto. So, Alexis, could you start by introducing yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm in Rennes. I'm a French guy living in the northwest of France. I was a Python hacker for Mozilla for 4 years and a half, where we created Kinto that we will talk about. I moved to a different position. I'm now studying a brewing IDE, a brewing project with some friends, and I'm volunteering on some open source projects. I believe that's it.
And Mathieu, how about you?
So yeah, I'm Matt. I mean, if Matthew is too hard, I'm okay with Matt. So
okay.
So hi everyone. I'm also French, as you may have noticed already. But I live in Barcelona in Spain, and I'm working remotely for the cloud services of Mozilla.
And how did you each get introduced to Python? Alexis, how about you go first?
Yeah, sure. So I was doing software development for a few years before I was doing like PHP and stuff. And I was an intern in a small company named Machina Corpus in the south of France. And I started hacking on a carpooling application that was built on top of Django. So that's how I got started. That was around, I think, 2009. And a few years after, actually, the project that really got me started with Python is Pelican, the block generation tool. And yeah, I believe that's the story. And then I joined Mozilla and started hacking full-time on Python.
And Matt, how did you get introduced to Python?
Well, a similar story. It's mainly via Django as well, maybe around 2008. And I was using Java first, like in the early 2000, and then lots of PHP. And when I switched to Django and Python, I was feeling very productive compared to the other programming language. So I started to use Python in every new project I was doing. So let's say thanks Django for that. That's how I came to it.
And so today we're talking about the Kinto project, which you've both contributed to. And I'm wondering if you can describe what Kinto is and how the project got started.
So Kinto is a service. It's a web service, and basically it's a generic JSON document store where you can store data and share and synchronize them across several devices. So basically it's a way for application authors to store and synchronize data for their application and let the users be in control of the location where they want to store their user data. And for the story behind it, it's quite a long story. So I can let Alex tell a part of it, and then I can complete if you want. Alex?
Yeah. Okay. So I think it all started like a few years ago. So I started working for Mozilla. I was involved in a bunch of other projects for non-profit organizations in my spare time. A few friends asked me like for one specific need that I didn't find any project to cover easily. They wanted to have something really simple. They wanted to have a map they could edit. And they could like store data in the map and filter. Like let's say I have different kinds of events in different parts of France. They wanted to be able to store all this data and find it back later. Some project existed, like Google Forms, this kind of stuff, but they were not letting the users in control of their own data. So after some research, we decided to, I started thinking about a generic tool for this. And I contacted Matt and a few of my ex-colleagues of the company where I was a trainee a few years earlier, and we started to discuss this using a pad online. And the main idea that came out was the idea of a generic HTTP backend where you can actually send data and validate this data depending on a schema. So you define a schema first, and then you send data, and it validates against this schema. So we had this idea in mind. A few months after, I think we met at a local event and we created the project, and we named it Daybed at this time. And it was something built on top of CouchDB and Elasticsearch. We hacked on it during our spare time for a year or two. But the project had many cool features, but it never had its momentum. It was doing too much, I think. So that's, I think, basically the story of the first half, like what we did with Daybed. And then a few years after, I was working on a team at Mozilla where we were interested in the concepts of that little generic backend. And Mathieu joined us at this time, and we started doing it again in a better way. But maybe you can explain this part, Matt.
Yeah, as you say, like the original idea was explored 6 years ago or something like that. So I was working in that services company, and every new project started with something like, hey, we need an API to store this and to store that. And, as good engineers, we know it was relevant to reuse some code from one project to another. But I was thinking but what if we could reuse the whole HTTP service? So when Alexis talked to me about that idea of a reusable storage backend, I was like, oh, okay, but that's an idea. I was already thinking about it. So we hacked together on the first thing, and then at Mozilla, Alexis was in the services team, so in the cloud services team. And obviously they also had many similarities between different projects. So slowly the idea of a reusable backend came on the table, and I had the chance to join them. I had the chance to join the team. So we started to work on a first project. It was the reading list project, where basically it was going to be the alternative, or an alternative to Pocket. Well, the project was not continued, but we kept the idea and we rebooted the Daybed, the original Daybed project from scratch, changing its name to Kinto. And we changed the approach. Like in Daybed, every time we had a new idea, we were implementing the new feature. But in Kinto, we were doing it for our employer, and we had to be wise and reasonable. So we were only waiting for real world use case, like real need, before implementing or adding features. So we avoid the software to be bloated, like we used to be with Daybed. So we rebooted the thing, and Kinto was born. That was maybe 2015, maybe May 2015, something like that. So a year and a half. I don't know if it was clear enough.
No, that was good. So can you describe a bit about how Kinto is architected and some of the layers that it uses to allow for such a generic API backend?
Yeah, sure. So the idea behind Kinto is actually pretty simple. It's an HTTP API that you put on top of a database. So the idea is to have a generic HTTP API to store data. The way it's architectured is kind of the same thing. So on the web part, we are using the pyramid framework. We store the data in different backends. By default, it's shipped with PostgreSQL, but you can actually plug other backends if you want. And thanks to the way pyramid is built, it's really simple. It was really simple for us to add ways to extend Kinto in several ways. So we have a bunch of plugins that allow to add new features when you need them. Even in the core of Kinto, you actually have plugins, like core plugins for the history management, for instance. So that's about how Kinto is architectured in general. So you get the full grasp of it. And then, in general, the idea behind Kinto is to separate the backend from the front end. So we have an administration interface. It is actually fully JavaScript. It's a web application. It relies on the HTTP API to interact with the Kinto database directly. So that's how we interface the application in general.
And for being able to add new plugins, is it taking advantage of the zope.interface library so that there's a specified set of entry points into the core Kinto for somebody else to be able to extend it?
Oh, it's not as complicated as that. We basically rely on the event subscriptions and request and response handlers that are provided by Pyramid. Of course, you can use like the Zopa interface if you want, like but it's not a prerequisite. The plugins we have usually work using events, so when a data is changed, for example, you can listen and receive an event and react on that event to, I don't know, store something somewhere else or handle the requests, some aspects of the request that you want to handle. So that's how we did plugins to store attachments on records, or plugins to track history of changes, or introducing digital signatures for guarantee of integrity and stuff like that.
And given that the primary format of the data that's being stored is JSON, I'm curious why you ended up choosing Postgres as the default database to ship with instead of something like CouchDB like you originally went with the first version of the project.
That's actually an interesting question. So I think Matt will be able to talk a bit more about why PostgreSQL is a good choice. But I think it's interesting to point that we were actually using CouchDB at first in the Daybit project. Our first idea was to add validation features directly to CouchDB to enable our use cases. I remember that we had a quick discussion that was a few years ago, so I don't remember exactly the specifics. But with one of the project authors of CouchDB, we found that the CouchDB architecture wasn't enabling us to tweak it in order to do validation using data that was stored directly in CouchDB, because we were in need to actually push a schema first and then use this schema to validate the data that was sent to the server. So we actually tried this at first, but like since Kinto is pluggable, it's completely possible to add a CouchDB backend now. So, as usual, if anyone has a use case for it, don't hesitate to contribute. So, that's possible. We actually have a contributor, Boris, who's working on a backend driver for MongoDB. And we also have a readily available Redis implementation. So we can use different backends. But by default, we use PostgreSQL, and I think Mathieu can explain better that because he convinced us all.
Well, actually, I'm not responsible for every choice we made around that. We have some constraints like production constraints. And for example, one of the reasons is that PostgreSQL is a lot easier to host, maintain, and deploy. So the sysadmin at Mozilla, for example, would expect us to provide very strong arguments before deploying exotic tech like Rethink DB or CouchDB. So PostgreSQL is like a very good old piece of software and very robust, and the ecosystem is very rich. So it's a natural solution for storing data in a permanent and solid way. And in terms of performance, the JSON-B feature, which arrived around version 9.4, is very efficient, and it allows us to query any kind of data, whatever the schema. Like, we don't have to do preliminary indexing like we used to have to do in CouchDB. So, it's like a very simple and convenient way to store data because it's very known and it's very common and it's very performant. So that was a natural choice.
Yeah, I can definitely attest to the fact that Postgres is a pretty solid piece of tech, having used it at most of my jobs. And the fact that it does support JSON out of the box these days is pretty useful. And also the querying capabilities are pretty powerful, being able to index into specific key paths and then return nested data directly from the contents of the JSON without necessarily having to retrieve the entire JSON file out into memory in the application and then parse it there before shipping it back up to the front end.
Yeah, which is one of the limitations we have with the Redis backend, for instance. When we need to query some specific things, we sometimes need to unpack the data on memory before returning it. So yeah, exactly.
So given the fact that there is that variability in how the different data backends can operate, is there also variability in the amount of features that can be supported when you're using those different backends?
No. So basically we have a subset of, we have a number of features that a backend needs to implement by default, if that has not changed since I looked at it. But I believe you need to actually support a bunch of operations.
Well, mainly transactions actually. So we have a transaction per request. So during the request, a set of operations are performed on the storage backend, and if something wrong happens, then we want to be able to roll back anything that has happened since the beginning of the request. So the backend has to have kind of transactional support, and otherwise the operation we have are very simple. It's like a CRUD, we create, update, delete, and then we fetch the list or individual records. So if the backend supports custom filtering or any filter on any column without schema, and then it's a lot more efficient, as you said, because you would let the backend do the filtering. But otherwise, which is the case of Redis, for example, would fetch the whole list of the collection and then perform the field filtering in memory. It's acceptable depending on the size of the data sets. Usually we deal with small collections of data because we deal with user data, and I don't know, maybe you are a very strong user of bookmarks, but if you have 10,000 bookmarks, it's still acceptable. I mean, it's not 10 millions. So that's just one point. I mean,
yeah, it really depends your needs.
So one of the core tenets of the project is the fact that it supports synchronization between different clients. And given that synchronization is such a difficult problem in computer science, I'm wondering how you've approached that, and what are some of the alternate solutions that were considered and ultimately discarded before you settled on the approach that you're using now?
I can try to answer that. So it's a very hard topic indeed. I mean, it's an academic challenge, and but we made several concessions, of course. And the concession we've made is that first we don't store the divergences, like the history of each record, like CouchDB would do. We only store the last version of a record, and we don't try to do magic. So basically the idea is there is a simple vector clock, something like every time a write operation is done, a timestamp is incremented. So we guarantee that every write operation will bump the value of a timestamp, and it's a linear history. So it's a line, it's not a tree. So every time a client comes and say, hey, my last version of the data is that timestamp, the server is able to give every new records since that timestamp. And if there are some conflicts, then we don't try to solve them ourselves. We let the developer handle the three-way merge and things like that. And usually the developers are in the best position to make decisions. And we don't try to be smart. We just make sure it remains very simple for most cases, which is most cases are either client wins, like the data on the client is going to overwrite the data on the server, or the server wins, which means the server is the source of truth, and we discard the client data. And for manual resolution of conflicts, we let the developer make some decisions based on his domain specific stuff. And when a data is deleted, we store something that we call a tombstone. It's basically an empty record that says that record was deleted at that timestamp. It's a way to track deleted things so that the client can apply the deletions locally. So the idea is very simple, and we inherited from the algorithm the Mozilla was using in Firefox Sync. So it's very simple and also robust and tested.
And the tracking of timestamps can be complicated by the fact that Kinto has a strong focus on offline first support for clients. So the timestamp that gets sent back to Kinto, is that the timestamp of when the record was modified locally on the device, or the timestamp that Kinto actually received it when the client comes back online if they were disconnected?
When the client comes back online, actually the client does not assign any timestamp, so the timestamps are assigned only when there is a communication with the server. So the server is the source of truth for timestamps. So that's basically also a very big simplification of the thing. There is, well, it's a negotiation between the server and the client when it comes to merging the changes on fields. But when it comes to timestamps, the source of truth is the server, and the client does not generate new timestamps. So
yeah,
that's the thing.
The big difference, for instance, with projects like CouchDB is the fact that they provide really useful master replication system, and we don't try to do this. Like we don't have the use case for it. So we are in a simple server and client relationship that simplifies a lot of things. And that's also why we don't need to store the divergence tree, because if you are master, you're not forced to do it, but it simplifies a bit the way to handle the merge.
So is the typical scale of use for Kinto largely for personal use, for people to have their own copy of data for a given application, or is there also sort of an equal or greater number of people who are using this in a production context with multiple users? Because I can see how gradations along that scale would have different requirements in terms of how it implements a synchronization algorithm, because if it's just one user who's using Kinto to store notes that they take across different devices, I can see how occasional conflict of data synchronizing or clobbering something would be much slower impact than if somebody were using this as a component of a production system where they have multiple users using the system and possibly even sharing data, where having the data get overwritten or needing to implement a more complicated conflict resolution algorithm would be more necessary.
I can try to answer that, but I'm not sure I have a good answer. So I think that the way we do it with Kinto is really simplistic in many ways. Like we have different use cases. Like at Mozilla, they are using Kinto to store, for instance, the certificate revocation lists. I'm not sure where they are with this project, but they are also using the Kinto project to store the web extension data, like Firefox plugins. They can store data on they're using Kinto for that. I'm not sure if that's still the case, Matt. You can.
Oh yeah, it's still the case.
Yeah,
so,
okay.
Yeah.
And I think that depending your use case, like actually only thing that differs is the way you deploy the Kinto architecture, because in terms of code, that's exactly the same thing for us. But if you have a large number of users and they're doing a lot of writes, for instance, the way to do it in order to scale, to shard the data. So you try to not have the users write to the same collections directly. And then in your deployment, you shard the database, and that solves the problem. And for small projects, you can have everything on one machine, and that works pretty well as well. So I don't know if you have anything else to tell about that.
Well, yeah, I think it's right to distinguish the use cases. So, I mean, it's a little side note of your question, because you were mainly mentioning many users trying to write on the same collection of data. So I was just gonna complete that and say, yeah, we have also lots of use cases where Kinto is used as a way to deliver data to the clients. So Alexis was mentioning the block lists. So it's basically a list of certificates, SSL certificate revocation, and that's one or two administrators at Mozilla that edit that list via Kinto, and then it's delivered to hundreds of millions of clients. And I think on production we have like several millions of requests per hour, but they're all read requests. So, and that can also be a case for your use case of Kinto. If you use Kinto as a way to deliver, I don't know, some settings, some translations, some, I don't know, game levels or some content, any generic content for your applications, like you can use Kinto as a way to deliver read-only data as well. As for the concurrency and scaling of concurrent write operations, indeed, if lots of users are going to edit the same record, then it's going to be very hard to reconcile, because since the reconciliations have happened on the client, when the client is gonna try to upload this new merged version, the server is gonna say, oh no, but somebody else already uploaded something here, so you have to reconcile it again. So it can be like a endless loop. So if that's the way to put it, if thousands of users are editing the same record, then Kinto is probably not the good solution. But in many use cases, it's not the case.
And going back to the subject of offline first support, I'm wondering if you can talk a bit to why that was a design consideration and something that you wanted to have in the project, and also why that's an important feature to have.
I think that's just a matter of anticipation, maybe. So I think there are different reasons for that. One of them is that at this time, a lot of people were talking about offline first, and I think it brings our attention on our attention on this. And then it's true that a lot of people are actually using devices where they don't have connection or they have limited connection. We thought it will be important for us to actually store the data locally. So it's possible to do it with Kinto. And we have like a JavaScript client that does it for you. But it's also true that a lot of use cases of Kinto are actually not using the local first approach. So like we have a bunch of demos which are actually just using Kinto as an HTTP API, and they're using it to store the data and to retrieve the data. They are not storing the content locally, but it's possible to do it if you want. So it's a matter of what your needs are.
We wanted Kinto to be a mobile app backend, and I think being able to use your application in the plane or in the train, it's a very cool feature. So we tried to we made our best to provide an abstraction on top of IndexedDB for the browser that you can, like, as an application developer, you just use that library, you CRUD your data locally, and when the application comes back online, you just call a sync method, and the client is going to handle the reconciliation, like the synchronization for you. But as Alexis said, it's not a prerequisite. Like, you can also have applications that don't rely on a local copy of the data. So it's a cool property, I think, in those days.
Yeah, being able to use an application even when you don't have an internet connection in the same manner as when you are able to interact in real time with the data source is very useful. For instance, one example that a lot of people will probably have experience with is being able to use their Gmail client while disconnected to draft an email and then schedule it for sending. And then when they do get connected back to the internet, it will just go ahead and send transparently and they don't have to worry about it. So experiences like that definitely increase the usability of a program, and as you said, as mobile becomes more ubiquitous, it becomes more of an important design consideration for anybody who is trying to design an experience. And continuing the subject of design and APIs, I can speak from experience that building usable APIs is complicated and has a lot of different considerations. So I'm wondering, what are the features that you prioritized while you were building out the interfaces to Kinto to try and make sure that they were sufficiently generic and reusable? And continuing on that a little bit, I know that making APIs discoverable is important as well. So I'm wondering what you did on that front.
So, yes, the thing is, we wanted the API to be a storage API, so it becomes natural to provide like a REST API. Our main focus at first was to respect every aspect or as many aspects as possible from the HTTP specification. So when it comes to status codes and headers, and make sure we don't reinvent anything. And it's more complicated than it looks like. For example, the patch method has many variants. So you can have different ways to patch your data. So there are, for example, the JSON merge RFC specification. RFC. You have the JSON patch, which is another one. So we always made sure that we respect the conventions out there. At some point, we were thinking of using the JSON API specification. So Steve, one of the authors, is a colleague. So we had some discussions with him. And actually, we quickly realized that the specification was addressing too much. So it was too much things to introduce, too many concepts to introduce. So we decided to keep it simple. It's a REST JSON API. We respect everything we know about status codes, headers, and mechanisms that are standard. And it's a hierarchy of so it's a storage hierarchy. So you have like a bucket in which you have collections, groups of users. Then you have collections of records. So everything it's like a storage tree. And every endpoint every resource endpoint is made the same way. So it's basically the same code running behind the HTTP endpoint. So every endpoint behaves the same way as the other. So there is no surprise, I would say. It's all like consistent. And that makes it very usable, because there is once you know how works one endpoint, you probably know already how the others would work too. So that's one part of the answer. And I don't know, Alex, if you want to talk about discoverability.
Well, we don't have a lot of things made about discoverability. We know that there are a lot of different ways to do it, but we didn't got any use case for it. So it's basically the answer we have for a lot of different topics. It's like, okay, what problem does it solve exactly? Like, do you have this problem right now? If we don't have it, we don't try to solve it.
Actually, that changed recently, like very recently. The quality assurance team, Mozilla, they want to have like a consistent way to make sure an API behaves properly. So they are introducing Swagger as well, it's now called Open API, but they're introducing Swaggers on some services just to make sure they can like scan the endpoints and think about ways to automatically detect anomalies in the APIs. So we have an outreachy program, which is basically an internship program, and we'll have some interns working on that precise topic, Swaggerification of the API.
So what are some of the most innovative uses of Kinto that you guys have seen?
We have Remy, which is a guy working on Kinto as well, and he did a proof of concept where Firefox translations could be updated remotely, unsynced to the different Firefoxes, like very easily, like without the need of riding the trains, like we say. So we like you could actually directly push an update with the new translations to all the Firefox if you need. And that was pretty cool because, well, that was a demo, right? But it was pretty neat to see that it was possible to do this with like a day of hacking. So that was nice. Other examples, like we have Matt and other Matt, which is hacking around Internet of Things. And he is currently building, like using Kinto as an API to store the data related to these physical objects. So he got a box which is named Nelson. I didn't know about that at this time. So it's just like a toy where you can specify your position. And it moves a stick that's inside the thing to the right position. All the data was stored directly in Kinto. He also was hacking on like a generic info box. So something that will actually grab data about like when will your bus, what is the hours of your bus, will you miss your train, like what kind of weather do you have currently, etc. And he was storing the data in Kinto while he was thinking about doing this. That's that's like two demos that I think about.
Then we have also cool demos that usually have a good impact, like web maps, where you can add and share some markers on the map in real time, or even like end-to-end client-side encryption, where users can encrypt data locally and then sync it via Kinto. So it's a very safe way to store data remotely, because anyone without the keys cannot read the data. So that was cool because it was using web crypto, which is pretty innovative. I like it.
Yeah. In terms of innovations, that's what I can think about a lot more. We have other projects which are using Kinto, like a project named the Form Builder, and it's actually like a way to create forms and send an URL to your users and ask them to enter information in the form, and then you have an administrative interface, exactly like what Google Forms does, but in a way that lets you own your data if you want. And we have a lot of other projects using Kinto.
For somebody who's starting a new project, what are some of the competing projects that somebody might use in place of Kinto, and why would they choose Kinto over them? I know one example would be something like Firebase.
So, there are a lot of different projects which actually kind of do the same thing that we do, but in different ways. We have actually a table of comparison with a bunch of projects on our website. On our documentation. But like talking about Firebase, we do not try to solve exactly the same things. So like the biggest difference with Firebase we have is the fact that you can actually own your data. You can host it yourself. You might not want to actually let your data be stored by a third party. So that's one of the main difference, but it's a political thing. It's not a technical difference. In terms of features, I don't have the table in front of me, but I think that we do not do, like, I see Firebase as a way to synchronize the data, like in terms of real-time synchronization. Like you push something and bam, it's there, right? It's like a way to synchronize directly with the different clients. Where with Kinto, it's more like you want to store the data and get it back on your other device. So it's kind of different. I can try to actually find it back on the website because I don't remember all the differences. Because a lot of people were asking us about the differences, right? So it's very interesting. So the other differences we have with Firebase is the fact that, for instance, we do file storage. We have a way to store files via an extension that they don't provide. Like one of the other big differences is, what if you need to actually have a different authentication? Like you want to reuse your authentication mechanisms that you are currently using at your company or whatever. Like currently you cannot extend the software that's running on Firebase, let's say. And then like you can actually go to another topic, which is CouchDB, because I think that CouchDB and PostGreSQL are solving a lot of different use cases, and they are a really cool tech that you might want to use to solve the same thing that you will solve using Kinto. The biggest difference with CouchDB is that we have two main differences. The first one is we provide what we call fine-grained permissions. And fine-grained permissions are, like Matt said, you can store your data in a bucket, which contains the collections, which contains records. At each different level, you can decide what kind of permissions you want to have. So for instance, you can say all the data that's stored in this bucket, I want to share it with Tobias, but not this specific record, or but not with this specific collection. Or you can do it the other way around. You can say, okay, I want to keep all the data in my bucket, my own, and I don't want to share it except if I explicitly say so. This is not really easy to do with CouchDB due to how it's architectured. Another big difference we have with CouchDB is the fact that CouchDB uses a MapReduce as a query mechanism, and it's not really easy to understand for newcomers. We try to avoid this thing, and we provide a easy to use query mechanism, which is using just filters. Like it's really like a matter of reading the documentation once and then you're done. Like you put the name of the field and you say, get me all the records where the name of this field equals this. You have all the data back. So that's the main differences. The other one is the fact that we provide a pluggable storage. So if you want to store your data in your preferred database, you might want to use Kinto instead of CouchDB, for instance.
Yeah, I can definitely see where that would be useful. For instance, if you have all of your Kinto data in either a table within a broader schema or even in its own schema, but in the same physical database, so that you could potentially join that information with other data from a separate application to integrate it at the data level. So what are some of the biggest challenges that the Kinto team has faced while building it?
Well, I think, as we said earlier, we made lots of effort to design the HTTP API so that it remains simple and standard. But since it's the main contract of the service, we have to guarantee a certain backward compatibility. So we design many things to ease the transition of clients when we would introduce a breaking change in the API. The clients would be aware of it via some specific headers and deprecation features. So we still make a lot of efforts to maintain the backward compatibility. But also a good challenge is to make sure the transition of clients is going to be smooth the day we introduce a breaking change, like a major version incrementation. So that's one of the big challenge, and that's like the technical one. But the main challenge currently, like I would say, it's since the variety of use cases is almost infinite with Kinto, it was very hard for us to communicate about the project and its goals, especially if it consisted in narrowing down the list of possibilities. Like, it was very frustrating to limit the possibilities just in order to communicate better, because we love our project, so we want to list everything it does, and it's actually counterproductive when it comes to communication and key selling points and stuff like that. So one of the biggest challenges is communicating on the project. And of course, we didn't have like all the graphical skills and to build shiny front-end apps or an effective landing page for the project. So we do our best, but some of our demos are very technical. So we wish someone would like to make them beautiful. I mean, visually beautiful, because end users don't look at the code. And also, I mean, building a community is hard, and especially when you're not good at communicating about the project. So it's like, yeah, building, like having clear communication about the features and stuff, it's hard.
Yeah, and it's not an end user tool, right? Like the difference when building a community, when you have a tool that does something that, you know, your users will use directly, is different as building something for the developers, because what we're providing is a tool for developers. So building a community around that is not it's not the same as what I knew, for instance. So yeah, it's a big difference.
Yeah, all the hardest problems in computing are people. And so for going back a little bit to the client applications, you mentioned that there's a JavaScript client library for Kinto. Is that something that you would pull in and embed into a larger application so that you could integrate it with something like React or Ember framework, for instance?
Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
that's the way we do it. And yeah, for example, most of our demos use React, but some people in the community use Ember. I'm not aware of any use case of Angular, but I know there are people interested because
There are people
Yeah?
actually. Sorry. Yeah. There are people using Angular to store data. Like that's the guy I'm brewing with, and he's doing an application to have the recipes of beers, and he stores everything in Kinto on. He's a Angular developer, so yeah, that's so we have a use for it.
And what's planned for the future of Kinto? What are some of the features that people can look forward to as it continues building out?
I think the biggest focus is polishing the product presentation. So we started with changing a bit the landing page. Nico did that like 2 weeks ago, on working on the documentation as well. Like I think we have a pretty good documentation, but it's complicated. Like you need to update it all the time to be sure that it's very easy to understand for newcomers, etc. So that's where we need to improve, make sure the product is well introduced. So that's one of the big area. Other than that, we have a push notification system that relies on pusher.com, and we plan to actually use web push instead, which is standard. And it's used in all the browsers now. We had an outreachy intern working on this. So thank you, Ipsha, for the work you did on web push. That's one of the next features that will land. And we also have a one-click installer. So we have a bunch of them already. So it's possible to, for instance, deploy Kinto on Heroku. Very easy. Like you just need to click a button, and if you already have a Heroku account, it's done. And we try to integrate with other cloud providers in order to have this. So that's what is planned. We also have a lot of ideas of stuff we want to do, but that are not planned yet.
And since the stack is currently it's on production right now at Mozilla, we're gonna make sure it's very stable. So we're probably in the next few weeks or months going to polish everything and probably find some bottlenecks or better ways to implement things that are already there. Like we probably not provide many new features, but make sure they work very, very well and they remain simple. So that can imply some work on the client side as well. Like the clients should be very intuitive and behave very consistently with the API. So apart from the push notification standardization, I would say there's no big thing coming. Probably some improvement around the documentation or authentication, because with Pyramid, the framework, it's very easy to do pluggable authentication. But for the end user, it's like very confusing as well, because then they ask but how do you authenticate? And if we answer only maybe you plug any authentication that you want, it's very confusing. So we'll probably work on some built-in providers, authentication providers, but we don't want to tie the project to Google, Facebook, or whatever. But even though that's the front end, what the front-end developers usually need. Like they say, oh, my users want to authenticate with their Twitter account, but we don't want to bind Twitter into Kinto. So we have to work on a better authentication configuration story. So we'll probably improve that. Everything is available already, but improve the experience.
I'm talking about this specific thing. One thing that will have been really useful is you might have heard about Persona, like the Persona authentication mechanism, which was a way to compete with authentication providers like Facebook and Google and Twitter, etc. We had Persona is now kind of dead, but we found out that some of the people behind the idea of Persona, like Dan, I think, is currently working on another project, which is named Portier. And it's pretty cool because the web really needs this thing. Like, we don't want to have Facebook on on Twitter, etc., like to be able to authenticate to a service. So it's nice. Like, we already, like, what it does is reuse your email address because everyone got an email address. So so yeah, that might be a cool direction for the integration of Kinto. We have not decided if we want to do that exactly or not.
And for somebody who's looking to contribute to the Kinto project, are there any areas in particular that you're looking for help, or any sort of associated work that could be done? For instance, building out some demo applications that are a little bit more visually appealing as a way to get people involved in Kinto?
Oh yeah, we take, well, basically we have different kinds of, we welcome any help, and there are different kinds of areas. Like we have easy picks, labels on the GitHub repo. So if you just want to get into the code and do something like small just to have a look, then come and see the easy picks. And otherwise, on the front end side, we welcome any help to make demos visually appealing, which is not one of our specialties. So we can also help building some demos, because that would be helping communicating about the project. If there are some cool application using Kinto, it's a good help, because it makes the project more valuable. And we also have like a administration UI, so it's a React application. So if you're more into JavaScript and front end, we welcome any help on that too. And some people really like writing documentations. So we have a very detailed documentation, and we probably lack some kinds of summaries or quick start pages. So we would welcome any help on that, like having like a 10 points quick start page or something like that. And it's really hard for us to do, because we have the whole context in mind. So it's very hard for us to have a fresh look at the project. Like, we know how it works, so we need someone that is new to get a look and say, okay, but here you give too much detail, I just want to get started, for example.
There are other areas that will be interesting, like crypto. For instance, you can use Kinto to do end-to-end crypto with your data. So you can store your data anywhere on any Kinto instance. You will actually encrypt and decrypt it only on the client side. So we have proof of concept for this, but the ecosystem behind this is not strong enough. So that will be one area that will be very interesting in developing. So if anyone has got any competence on this matter, that will be a very cool addition, I think.
So are there any other topics that we should cover before we close out the show?
I think we're done.
So for anybody who wants to follow you or keep in touch with either of you personally or the project at large, what would be the best ways for them to do that?
So for the project, I think the best way to follow what we do is to see the announces we do on the project directly. So we are developing Kinto on GitHub. So just following the project there is simple enough. Otherwise, we have a Kinto mailing list if you're interested in announcements. So we're publishing all the new versions, announcing the new versions there, having discussions around Kinto there. It's a low traffic list. I think that's the best way. And if you want to get in touch with us personally, I think for me the best way is email. You can find that on notmyid.org. That's my domain name. There is my email over there.
Yeah, and for me, IRC or Twitter, email is perfect.
Great. So with that, I'll move us on into the picks. And my pick today is just going to be a discussion topic that one of the listeners of the show introduced on the Discourse forum recently about what I'm working on this week with Python. So just a way for all the listeners of the show to hop in and share, what are some of the projects that you're working on? What are you using Python for, as a way to sort of build up more communication, as well as expose people to various ways that Python can be used that may not fit within any individual person's typical wheelhouse. So if anybody's interested in hopping in and contributing some feedback on that topic, I think that would be great. I'm definitely interested to see what are some of the ways that people are using Python in their day-to-day. So with that, I will pass it to you, Alexis. What do you have for us for picks?
That's a good question. I think that I will talk about music. So I actually rediscovered an album very recently. It's a very well-known album by Miles Davis, and it's Bitches Brew, if you know it. And it's actually very interesting to see that, well, actually to hear that this music is not aging. It's exactly like it was done yesterday, but I don't know how old is it, but that's very interesting. So Bitches Bro, I think.
Great. And Matt, what do you have for picks?
Oh my God, I was like entering into panic to find out something interesting to share. I have some regrets because it's a good idea is gonna come in 5 minutes when we close up the show. So I'm sorry. I love you, everybody. That's
So I really appreciate the both of you taking some time out of your day to tell us all about Kinto. It's definitely an interesting project and one that I've already got a few ideas for how to use it. I'm definitely going to be keeping track of it as it goes into the future, and I will definitely let you know if and when I build something with it. So thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you for the invitation as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Tobias. Thank you, everyone.